Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. Today I have a special episode for you about the Lot of Fortune. I spoke with the brilliant Ryberg. In this conversation, we cover the basics of this technique, this lot, but it's really meant as a short, digestible introduction to the topic. I would suggest that you please visit Kira's website, which is linked in the show notes, to acquire her more comprehensive lectures on the Hermetic lots, zodiacal releasing, and other topics. Before we jump into the conversation, I want to give a bit of a content warning about this episode. Because we're talking about the lot of the moon, we talk a lot in this conversation about the intersection of care, fate, and trauma, especially as it relates to the divine. So I just want to give listeners a heads up that this is a pretty heavy conversation, but I also personally found it to be really beautiful and very meaningful. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm offering needle and timing consultations, as well as answering corollary questions. Thanks again to all those that have offered their generous support. I really appreciate you. Now for today's conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Please be sure to check out the links to Kira's website and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. Kira Ryberg, thank you so much for being here with me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to be here, excited to talk about the Lot of Fortune and just have this conversation with you.
Yeah, I'm super excited as well. Wanted to throw you an immediate curveball question that's not about the Lot of Fortune at all, but you're Mercury ruled, and how is the recent Mercury Cazimi for you?
Oh, it kind of felt very uneventful for me in some ways. I don't know if it's because I'm just in a Venus year, so I'm really feeling that like impending retrograde more than anything right now. Or maybe it's because the moon was averse to the Cazimi in Cancer, but I didn't get the kind of Cazimi moment that I maybe was hoping for. But I think, I try to enjoy all of the moments. It was a chiller day, and I think sometimes that's just as good as having some like major Cazimi moment, just to sit in it and see what arises.
A chill day during Cancer season sounds lovely to me. That's awesome.
Needed, yeah.
Yeah. Can you offer us just an introduction to yourself and your work, how you got to be where you are today, and just a little bit about your practice, some teachers who've influenced you, and maybe even a little bit about like your philosophical perspective, where you kind of the view that you come from when you practice astrology.
Yeah, sure. Big questions. So I'm Kira. I'm an astrologer. I'm a writer, diviner, wannabe philosopher a little bit. I come mainly from like a Hellenistic background with astrology, and so more of like the traditional kind of side of things. And I got into that quite early, whereas I think many people tend to start with modern and then find traditional along the way. I got into it pretty early on, so that's really been kind of my primary education. And I've learned from Chris Brennan and Robert Schmidt, Austin Coppock, Christopher Warnock. Those are probably my main teachers. And I think the philosophical question is probably what we're going to talk about a lot in this episode when we get to the fate stuff. But probably, it could all be distilled down into as above, so below. Everything that is kind of happening out there is also happening right down here, and using astrology as kind of a tool to engage with that, to gain greater clarity, understanding, and to kind of just connect with the cosmos and the world and everything that is and will be and has been. And yeah, I don't know if that answers the question or if that's a little too out there. It's probably how I would define it.
Yeah, awesome. I love that. Yeah, like what's the nature of time?
Yeah.
Things is things happening? Are things happening in the future, in the past? Are they all happening right now? I don't quite know.
Yeah, exactly. Is it linear? Is it not? Our perception of it is. And there's certainly tools that we can use to access it from a linear perspective, but who really knows?
Just because something's linear doesn't mean it's also not other shapes and sizes and what have you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Especially from a different perspective outside of your own.
Mm, yeah. Wonderful. So we're going to talk about the lot of fortune today. What is a lot and why are lots important in astrology?
Yeah, so a lot in the technical sense is just like this mathematically derived point in the chart, which basically takes the distance from the sun and the moon, or the moon and the sun, or any type of planets or points in the chart. You can use different ones for different lots, and you project it forward from the ascendant to personalize it. So it really makes it personal to you and your specific moment that you were born or incarnated on this earth. And so the thing about lots that I think is really cool is that they speak to our allotment in life, right? That's literally where the word
Mm,
comes from. And so it tells us something that we're not always going to see from just looking at the planets and the houses and everything that we tend to take into consideration, because the lots have to be sought out and calculated. So they have a little bit more of this mysterious kind of component to them. And I think
hmm
it's Robert Schmidt who says they hold like the secrets of the chart. And so I think that there's a lot of really powerful things that you can glean from working with the lots. There's a lot of information about your purpose, your motivation, your desires, all of these different things. And the Greek word for degree, as in zodiacal degree, comes from Moira, which is, where we see the Moirai, which is literally the
mm,
triple fates, or, the three sisters. And so we kind of see this really beautiful metaphor being laid by, the etymology of these words, and just that every degree in the zodiac is going to have a specific allotment of fate, and looking at which degrees the lots fall in specifically are going to tell you a lot about your allotment or your fate. So I think they're a really cool way to just engage with astrology that isn't maybe just the planets, and there's so much that you can get from that as well, but I really love
hmm
love the lots and kind of digging into those mysteries.
mm. Yeah, that's awesome. You're reminding me of the fact of the concept of the monomoria, which is like each degree, in a circle there's 360 degrees.
Mhm.
We split that up into 12 signs, 30 degrees in you know, tropical Hellenistic astrology or whatever kind of astrology. Maybe there's different ways that they do it in some
Maybe
other
your
kind of
reading
astrology.
astrology is different. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what they're doing over there. No shade. I want to learn about that at some point too. But yeah, like there's a characteristic of each degree, which is like um I think Cameron Cassidy does a lot of like looking at
Yeah.
the monomoria. And it's like, yeah, it's pretty obscure and it could be hard to say like what each degree means, but there is a lot of information in each degree. Like, yeah, it's interesting. I'm reminded of like grains of sand on a beach. It's like they
Yeah.
all, there's like infinite grains of sand on a beach, or there's infinite stars in the sky, but they all create the bigger picture of the landscape of the beach. Or when we look up at the sky, the awe we feel when we, are just looking at a clear star-filled night. So there
That's
feels something poignant
beautiful.
about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's how I feel when I look at a birth chart. You see all of the
Mm,
different grains of sand, all the different placements, the lots, maybe the asteroids, the points, and it comes together to tell you this really beautiful story of this person's life, their fate, their circumstances, how they respond to things, their motivations, their desires. And there's so much that you can, engage with from that lens. And it's beautiful. It's awe-inspiring. Like you said, it's like looking up
yeah.
at the sky and just taking in all of the stories, the myths, the history,
Mm,
knowing that everybody that came before you also looked up at those stars and felt
mm,
something too, and I think
yeah.
it's kind of what we're doing. We're engaging with astrology a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And before I forget, I want to ask, so each house has significations, and often uh obviously, with whole signs, a planet will rule a sign, will rule a house, and they'll kind of have rulership over those topics of life.
Yeah.
Lots are often very topical. Like you have the lot of union, which is about marriage and can be perhaps associated with the seventh house. And, there's all these different kind of topical lots that we have. And so, what's kind of the order of operations that you look at in terms of like, do you look at lots as a addition to a house, how that the description that the house is giving, or how does that kind of work in your
Yeah.
practice?
Yeah, in my practice, I kind of tend to view like houses as ecosystems. So
Mm,
everything within that house is going to affect the ecosystem and the climate of the things that are going on in there. So every lot is going to have something to say about where it's placed. But I don't tend to use it as like a alternate, almost like overlay, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
When you're reading like the lots, like in Bonati or something like that, they list them by house actually. So they do kind of do that framework of like, these are all the houses that would pertain to, or all of the lots that would pertain to seventh house matters kind of things.
Right.
This is going to get more specific. And so I kind of tend to use it as, okay, let's check in for if we're, you know, someone wants to know about marriage. We're going to look at seventh house stuff. We're going to look at Venus, and then maybe we'll look at like the lot of marriage or the lot of union or the lot of love, the lot of eros. There's a couple different ones that you can use. So kind of add it to the description. But as a more like holistic framework, I tend to just view it as like everything within a given house is going to affect the matters of that house, and kind of, you know, I tend to view it like almost like you're on an island and something could be happening on one side of the island, but it's still going to affect everything else that's happening on the other side of the island too, in microscopic ways or macroscopic ways, depending on the nature of the event. You know, if it's a transit, if it's a really big one, if it's a small one, right, it's going to have an effect on everything else that's going on in that house. And so it's going to have an effect on the lots, on the zodiacal releasing from those lots, right, on any planets placed there. All of those things are going to kind of be pulled into this storyline.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as you kind of alluded to, you can perfect kind of signs and houses, but the releasing of lots can give us a lot more information as well, which we'll get into in a little bit.
Yeah.
So can you tell us more about like, what is the lot of fortune and how is that associated with the moon? In addition, I didn't really know this until we kind of, before I forget, I just want to also say thank you to everybody who responded on Twitter when I asked for questions for this episode. There were so many great questions. We're not going to get to cover all of them today, but there were just some really thoughtful questions, and I really appreciated everybody's feedback. One of them was that there are differences in modern astrology with significations of the lot of fortune, as opposed to more traditional significations, which is not something I really knew that much because, like you were saying, I'm kind of one of those people who came into astrology studying Hellenistic and then studying medieval without really having a foundation with modern. And so there's a lot about modern astrology I actually don't really know that much about in some ways. Sure. So can you tell us some more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think in modern astrology, people tend to hear a lot of fortune and associate it with what we believe fortune means today, which is good luck, right? Like this element of like favorable chance, which is not necessarily what fortune is. Fortune is just chance. It doesn't mean things are going to go your way, you know? And I think a lot of people in modern times or in modern astrology, and this is, you know, I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong. It's just certainly not how I practice and not how I found the lot of fortune to show up in charts and working with it. But there tends to be this idea that it's kind of holds your personal fortune in the chart. Like it's a lucky point. Like it can point to where, oh, if you just like go towards a lot of fortune and do those things, like, you know, good things will happen to you. When you have transits to a lot of fortune, it's going to be good things. And I don't think that that's necessarily capturing what the lot of fortune is truly about, because from a traditional perspective, it was much more about, this is kind of your fate. This is a roll of the die, you know, and that could be good. Like I always say, sometimes it's like you're rolling double sixes and sometimes you're not, you know what I mean? And that's kind of what fortune is going to speak to. So it's all of the matters that befall you through no volition of your own. And when I first heard that, that tends to be like the thing that a lot of people say, like Chris Brennan really says that for the lot of fortune a lot. And I kind of felt like it was too general. Like I didn't get it, you know? And then you start working with a lot of fortune, you're like, oh, it's all of the things that I just don't have control over, that I have no influence over. You know, it's like whether you run into someone and you have a chance encounter, that's a fortune. If you have something just, you know, a car hits you in the middle of the street, that's fortune. Like those things that just occur from happenstance, right? Those things that are fated to happen that you just don't have it's not coming from you. It's not your fault. There's someone to blame, right? Like it's just the things that occur naturally. And so that's kind of what fortune is speaking to, like our material reality. It's related to the moon. So it's going to share some significations with the moon, such as being related to your physical body and to your health. And, you know, on a baseline level, I often say the lot of fortune is kind of the hand you're dealt in life.
Mm-hmm.
And then the lot of spirit, which is the sun's law, is how you play those cards.
Mm.
And so a lot of times we're just looking at your almost like baseline level of circumstance with the lot of fortune. And it was, you know, the archetypal lot. So it was the first lot. So the one that we have like the oldest kind of sources on and things like that. And so, you know, there's different things that you can do with a lot of fortune, like fortune houses. And it was kind of conceptualized to almost be a different set of significations that were based on a much more lunar kind of reality, whereas like the standard house system is kind of based on the sun's motion. And so we have an alternate, you know, more lunar signification of the houses when you look at the houses derived from the lot of fortune. And so it's just going to speak a lot more to those material circumstances in life.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I just want to emphasize that point of the lot of fortune being potentially an alternative ascendant,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes referred to as the ascendant of the moon.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an interesting thing. I think it was 2005. Robert Hand did a lecture on the lot of spirit as an alternative ascendant. So there's like all these different ways that people are playing with these ideas of what does this chart mean and what does this chart mean with this point as the ascendant. And I think the lot of fortune, as you described, was like, yeah, having to do with fatedness and having to do with how things will kind of play out. And I don't know if I'll be able to describe this quite as succinctly as he does, but the lot of spirit as the ascendant, which is the lot of sun, the lot of the sun, the lot of, you know, again, what you said, the things we choose, the actions that we kind of take. If that's the chart, that's almost like if we were living our perfect spiritual path, that would be our chart. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, or if you have any additional things that you'd like to say about like fortune as the ascendant of the moon and fortune houses as well.
Yeah, I haven't fully dug into spirit houses, although it's something that I think is really interesting. And I thought about it
Mm-hmm.
and found out about that Robert Hand lecture. And I was like, oh, that's very cool that someone's also, you know, kind of explored this idea before, because it almost will tell you your chart from the lens of your responses, you know, which is an interesting thing rather than a lot of fortune telling you your chart from the lens of just the things that are happening and befalling you. And, you know, with fortune houses, one of the ideas that Robert Schmidt kind of put forward was that throughout our lives, we move closer and closer to the lot of fortune and the houses as our ascendant, because our future becomes more determined, right? Like the longer you live, the further down certain paths you get and the harder it gets to turn back. And, you know, certain decisions you make, you can't unmake those. And so your path kind of gets, I don't want to say smaller because that sounds like there's a negative context to that, but almost like the multitude of paths in front of you start to kind of dwindle because of certain choices you've made. And so you'll be closer and closer to fortune as you age, as your fate becomes more set in stone. So you can think about almost like the house that holds your lot of fortune as being what you're moving towards in this life and what you're probably going to, you know, engage with on a more material level of reality throughout your lifetime. And so, you know, not just the first house as fortune is the ascendant, but also the second house is like finances, and third is, you know, siblings and community and friendships. Like you can do this for all of them. And then there's also a entirely different set of significations for the fortune houses that was put forward by, I think it was Manilius and like the places of Athla or something. And those have completely alternate significations that are not necessarily what we would kind of traditionally attribute to each house. And so that's another whole other thing that you could explore if you were
Okay.
so curious. I think Wade Caves just did a talk about this at Norwalk and had some things to say
Okay.
about that. So yeah, something to check out.
Cool. So yeah, we'll point people in the direction of that if they are interested in learning more about fortune houses. The metaphor that kind of came to mind when you were talking about the lot of fortune and moving towards that in life, I was reminded again of the Moirai, and it's like as you move through life, you have less thread. You know, if we
Yes.
think of thread, like the thread of our lives, we kind of use it up as time goes on. And so it's like there felt something resonant with that. And it reminded me of the fact that I did know about the difference between the modern and the pre-modern significations for the lot of fortune. And I just wanted to comment on the philosophical tradition and how philosophy kind of deals with fortune, because it's very evident in philosophical texts that fortune is not necessarily a good thing. And I run in 12-step recovery circles, and so I'm very familiar with the Serenity Prayer. And
Mm,
there's one of the things that you spoke to that kind of reminded me of that, how often when people say that, they will focus on the first part of the prayer, which is, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. The second part is the courage to change the things I can. And the
mm,
third part is the wisdom to know the difference. And people kind of want serenity to accept. But I think the more that I've thought about it over the years, I've been sober for like a few years. Um, it's really the wisdom that's important,
mm,
because it's really important to know what things in life we can't change and what things in life are possible for us to change. And that may seem straightforward, but I think like the whole tradition of philosophy perhaps is about delineating and permeating those lines of what is fated and what is free will, and like where is our agency there. And I mentioned this on another episode, but this kind of goes through the tradition of the philosophical tradition in a number of texts. The two that come to mind right now is the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, which was, I think he was a 3rd century writer, and he was a Christian until he was jailed and executed. And in his prison cell, he wrote a book called The Consolation of Philosophy, where he turned away from Christianity and turned towards philosophy. And he speaks about the goddess Fortuna and the wheel of fortune and the changing ways of fortune. And that was really kind of the conception of fortune in a pre-modern sense, that fortune was the wheel of life that we cannot control the spin of, and sometimes it brings you up and then it brings you down. And the cultivation, what's to be cultivated, is wisdom, is virtue. And that even goes later on into the tradition, oddly enough, in The Prince, which by Machiavelli, which is like often thought about as like a really kind of well, the term
yeah.
Machiavellian is like kind of has a sinister bent now, but he's really talking about, and there is some things in that book that are quite of that nature, but he's really talking about how to navigate fortune and virtue. So that's just kind of what came to mind in relation to that I wanted to add a little bit. Any thoughts that arise as a result of that?
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking about how, you're talking about the wheel of fortune and kind of that notion of rising and falling. And I think that's kind of where I find a lot of comfort in fortune, is that it's not necessarily, like I said before, someone's fault or no one's to blame. It's just the natural cycle of life. Like things
Mm-hmm.
cannot always be good. There will be times where they're difficult. Every inhale has an exhale, every sunrise has a sunset. We're always going to be navigating this kind of framework of light and dark and, favorable and not so favorable. And I think fortune really speaks to that ebb and flow in a really profound way. And I think it can bring a lot of acceptance for the times that are maybe a little bit more on the downswing, and an appreciation for the
Mm-hmm.
times when there's an upswing, without necessarily attaching some kind of moral judgment to the quality of the period. It's not like you're having an upswing because you're just a really good person, or you're having a downswing because you're a bad one, right? Like everybody is going to have periods of greater happiness and greater ease, and times where things are just a little bit more challenging. And so I think that's really like the nature of fortune, and it's really the nature of fate, and kind of where I find a lot of comfort in that perspective rather than finding fear.
Mm. Yeah, that's beautiful. That idea that like all things all things must pass away. You
Mhm.
know, the most comforting is obviously the challenging things that we face, but I think there's a poignancy in acknowledging that the good things pass as well, and can
Mhm.
call us to really be grateful for the benefit that we receive from those things, or the joy we receive from those things, because those are also fleeting experiences.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
all ephemeral, right? Which is so what I love so much about ZR is it can really show you those moments where there is going to be greater ease. And when you know you're in that, you savor it, you appreciate
Mm-hmm.
it because you can also see the end date. And so you know that
Mm-hmm.
it's going to come to a close. And there you have to kind of develop a certain level of acceptance with that, right? And you can see maybe you're going to enter a difficult period for a good, while. And that can be hard to sit with ahead of time. And then you get into the period, you're like, okay, this is just the downswing, like this is the exhale, like this is the ebb,
Mm-hmm.
that's okay. And
Yeah.
again, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong or that life has turned against you. It just means that this is the natural kind of order and flow of things. There's always going to be, life is full of cycles, right? And some cycles are more favorable and some are a little bit more challenging, but they all hold value and they all exist for a purpose. And it's what time has done since the creation of everything basically has been this nature of cycles, so we're just a
Mm-hmm.
part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get into ZR a little bit. I'm curious, like some ways that we can use the lot of fortune in chart delineation or timing techniques. How does that figure into your practice? I think some things come to mind are, of course, ZR, which is an important part of your practice, perfections as well. And then just in terms of chart delineation, I think like um, how do you kind of delineate natal aspects to a lot or the lot of fortune in particular?
Yeah. So I mean, we could probably break those down because those are like a couple different things that we could talk
Hmm.
about, like
Sorry
probably
about that.
no, you're fine. Yeah, like, starting with ZR, I feel like a lot of fortune for ZR, you can use it to time your life. Basically, what ZR does is it gives you a timeline. And if you know how to interpret that timeline, it's not just some list of dates. It's actually telling you what's happening, when it's happening, how it kind of lines up in the ebb and flow cycle of everything. Are you at a peak? Are you at a pivot? Are you at, a moment where things are a little bit more neutral or calm? And so when you do ZR, cycle releasing from the lot of fortune itself, you can do this for health matters. You can do it for, again, kind of that like baseline level of circumstance and your material reality. So a lot of times it does have to do with money, how much you can support yourself, provide for yourself. It will also speak to those kind of big fated life events that just happen to you. So if you
Hmm.
see like a big loosing of the bond period, which kind of is indicative of a major turning point in someone's life, then that could be, something major befalling them that then changes their course of action or changes kind of the course of their life because something occurred outside of their, own, it's not a response. It's something that's occurring to them. And
Hmm.
so that can kind of be looked at from the lens of the lot of fortune, along with just seeing, I think, most people use it for health and just like bodily
Yeah.
bodily a lot of the time. And yeah, that's kind of how I use it from ZR. Any questions on that, or like can I
No,
clarify?
I think that kind of makes sense, and I guess I'll just give people like an example from my own life.
Mm.
I mentioned sobriety earlier, and actually, when I was 18, I went through a peak period from I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was like I think loosening of the bond from L2, L3, and L4. So for
Yeah.
ZR, for people who don't know, there are like multiple levels that have different time frames. So L1 is years, and then months, and then days and hours. I think that's a good way to kind of
Yeah.
explain it, right?
Yeah, you
Yeah,
got
it's
that.
so I was basically like, okay, something, if I'm just looking at it on paper and I don't know, I'm not living my life, I'm like, okay, something wild happened here. There was some major pivot, and that was actually when I got sober when I was 18, going
Wow.
through, yeah, a loosening of the bond on L2, L3, and L4, I think, and a peak
Mhm.
on L1,
There you
peak on
go.
L1 through 4. So, yeah, looking back on that, I think was just like a very interesting experience because I think most people, I consider addiction kind of like a health issue. And I think most people might think it's more of a choice that you make, but there was an element for me of feeling like I was very much in the right place at the right time so that I could make the choice if it indeed was a choice, like a free will kind of choice that I was making.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like seeing that to know that it's going to be a major turning point in your life regarding your health, regarding your body, right? Those are really big things. Like overcoming addiction is no small feat, you know? And so when you can see that in someone's chart, when you can validate that experience in their life, that can be really profoundly healing and validating for a lot of people to know that, oh, wow, I did that. And that was a really big moment. And I've
Hmm.
come out the other side and I can see how everything has changed from that point, from that turning point. And so I think there's something really beautiful with the way that that illustrates, someone's life and kind of the experiences they're going through. And if you went back and checked and looked at, which house was getting activated and the rulers and the aspects and all of that, you'd
Hmm.
probably be able to put the story together really, elegantly of that journey that you went through.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely more to that, but we don't have to get into that.
Yeah, for sure. So then there's also, other ways that you can use the lot of fortune for timing techniques and things like that. You can use it for perfection. So you can perfect from the lot of fortune itself, which was, I know, a really common thing to do in medieval times, right? Or
Hmm.
medieval times, medieval astrology. I'm thinking of like the medieval times thing in LA, where you go and watch like the knights joust each other. I don't know
Uh-huh.
why
Uh-huh.
that came to mind. But anyway, in medieval astrology, really common to use the lot of fortune as a place to profect from. And
Hmm.
so you can use that. Maybe you could speak to that because I think you're a little bit more well versed in the medieval Islamic astrology than I am.
Yeah, I do perfect from the lot of fortune. And just for anybody that maybe is like super beginner and doesn't know what perfections means, like every year, generally people do it from the ascendant, but you can perfect from any point or planet in this chart. You just move one sign, starting from the first sign to the second sign to the third sign. And so every year corresponds with one of the signs and, one of the houses if you're using whole signs. I look at perfecting from the lot of fortune in client sessions as the things that will befall the person in that year. And so a lot of the times I'm looking at if the lot of fortune is moving to a conjunction with a natal planet, that's going to give some information. In addition, where is the ruler of that? And does the ruler aspect the perfected lot of fortune natally? Because if that is the case, then I kind of generally delineate that depending upon the aspect. If it's an opposition or if it's a square, it might be a little different, but I generally kind of delineate it as things are going to happen and the native will have some ability to manage the way that those things unfold and perhaps turn it to their good purpose. If there's not an aspect, it's a little bit more challenging. There might be things happening that feel or are, in fact, out of control. So that's a little bit of how I kind of use it in my practice.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think even, the thing about having the lack of control when there's the lack of aspect or the lack of visibility, that kind of feeling of
Mm-hmm.
things are just happening around you and you just don't know how to move forward. You don't know what to do about it. That can kind of happen when we don't have the aspect from the Lord to the law, because it creates almost a sense of lack of resources, lack of visibility, lack of clarity. And so, in a natal chart, you can obviously delineate this similarly, where you're looking at the things that are going to befall the person. You're looking at matters related to their body, their physical health. It can show up for like pregnancy stuff for women, of course. Those types of things are going to be really prominent with a lot of fortune. And so, if you're having the malefic contrary to sect opposing the lot of fortune, then that's probably going to create some more challenges for the person with the things that befall them with their health. And
Mm-hmm.
depending on which planet is ruling the lot of fortune, which planet is opposing, which houses those are placed in, you can kind of see where the difficulties are arising from. Like Marie Antoinette has this in her chart, Cancer rising with a lot of fortune in the first house, and it's opposed very, very tightly by Saturn and Capricorn in the seventh house. And
Mm-hmm.
so obviously a lot of the horrible things that befell her, like losing her literal head, were
Mm-hmm.
as a result of her husband and that
Right.
marriage. And so you can kind of see, it's like Saturn and Capricorn in the seventh house, very strong, very powerful, but opposing that lot of fortune, creating some real harm to Marie and her body and like her physical health, and there were certain things in her chart with her lot of fortune where, it's ruled by the moon in Libra in the fourth house with Jupiter. So there's a lot of benefic support there too. And
Mm-hmm.
she was born into a royal family. She was like the archduchess, right? She gets kind of wedded or betrothed around like 14, 15, around the time of her Saturn opposition to
Mm,
King Louis of France. And so we see like there is certain levels of her privilege or her baseline material circumstances that are spoken to through the angularity of fortune, through the angularity of its ruler, the co-presence with a benefic with the ruler. But we also see the opposition from Saturn creating some really challenging circumstances for her as well. So you can kind of look at, all of those different factors, and they're going to tell you different things, right? We can see that she gets privilege from her family, but we can also see that her marriage is going to create a lot of difficulties for her, especially as it relates to her health and the things that kind of happen to her outside of her control.
mm. Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you for that. Yeah, I guess the only other thing I want to touch on in terms of like needle stuff is to just remind people of the series I did about Rob Hand's comments about like professional astrologers and
Yeah.
Mercury being conjunct a lot of fortune or being or ruling the lot of fortune. And so I feel like I'm still kind of in the works on that, working on like a control group for like non-astrologers to see how often that shows up and see if the results that we found were as kind of striking as
Mhm.
striking as they like are they really as striking as they seem, or
Yeah.
does this just show up in a lot of people's charts even if they're not astrologers, kind of thing. So I'm still working on that, but we did find like a high percentage of professional astrologers meeting that criteria. Of course, that's not the only criteria that makes an astrologer, but it does kind of point to a principle that different planets conjunct or ruling the lot of fortune can kind of shape the flavor of how that shows up, or even like the place where people get money or how people resource themselves or what have you. So yeah, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, any planet or even any lot that is conjoined to another lot is going to influence the way that those significations show up in someone's life, right? Like you are influencing the allotment for that person.
Mm-hmm.
So if
Mm-hmm.
Mercury is influencing your allotment of fate, you're going to be fated or you're going to be drawn towards more mercurial pursuits, right? Mercury is the diviner, the ruler of astrology. There's so many different significations there that we can see like, oh, well, when we look at baseline material circumstances, how is someone getting those met? Well, you're going to have the Mercury influence on that. So you're more likely to get those met through mercurial affairs or tasks or things
Mm-hmm.
like that. If there's any other lot present with like the lot of fortune specifically, that's also going to influence your experience of the lot of fortune. If
Mm.
you have the lot of Eros right there, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, desires and Venusian things are going to be part of what befalls you. And it's a little bit nicer
Mm.
than having maybe, the lot of Nemesis there, which I think,
Right.
Robert Schmidt kind of really nonchalantly goes, well, better luck next life, and I obviously don't agree with that. And I think that's very, kind of taking it too far. But you can kind of
Mm-hmm.
see how, a lot of people have worked with this is, the lot of Nemesis is Saturn's lot. And so you're going to have more Saturnian things befalling you. Saturn is the natural significator of death, of loneliness, depression, some of the harsher themes and experiences of life. And so if someone does have Saturn or the lot of Nemesis next to fortune, then that is going to color their experience of the things that befall them, which is naturally going to feel a little bit less enjoyable than having the lot of Eros or like the lot of victory, which is Jupiter's lot, which is probably, in my opinion, a lot more close to what we believe the lot of fortune is in modern times, where it's like
Mm-hmm.
that actually is kind of a lucky point in the chart and
Right.
can where you get aid and assistance from other people specifically, like collaborations and things of that nature. And so having that next to the lot of fortune, well, you might just have people showing up to help you out all the time, even though you're not doing anything to kind
Mm-hmm.
of, bring that to yourself. And so, yeah, it's definitely going to color the flavor of what happens to you if there's a certain planet or lot in the same house or nearby.
Mm. Awesome. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to give a plug to Tal's podcast Tiger Time, which is kind of like I listened to your episode about fate on his podcast, and I was like, man, I gotta talk to Kira. I gotta talk to Kira about the like fate in some way. And the thing that was really striking to me, and we kind of have touched on this in this conversation, where yeah, life has seasons, life has ups and downs, but for me, it brought up this kind of tension of like the moon being associated with care.
Mm,
But there's also this association with the moon, with a lot of fortune, with what's fated for us. And I think people, including myself, can have a hard time with the idea of fate
yeah,
because like I've had some hard times in my life, and I think that people who have experienced challenging things, and I'm reminded of Sam Reynolds' recent Norwalk talk about like astrology and trauma, where it's
mm,
like it's one thing to kind of experience a challenge, and then it's another thing to experience a challenge to the extent where it kind of changes
yeah,
who you are as a person. And I think it can be really hard for people to kind of like want to let go of this idea of free will and give into this idea of certain things being fated because they've been let down, because they've experienced pain in life, perhaps to the extent of trauma.
mhm,
And I think that, acknowledging a certain amount of fatedness can evoke fears of around like the subject of kind of like God doesn't care about me, like if things are fated, if everything happens for a reason. And I know that those aren't necessarily the same things. It's like, what does it mean for God to be God? What does it mean for evil to be in the world? And I know that these are age old questions,
yeah.
but I'm curious your thoughts on that, especially given your views on fate.
Yeah, it's a big question. Like you said, it's kind of the age-old question of like, well, if God exists, why is there evil in the world? Or why are bad things happening to people? Why do people experience real trauma in their lives? And I think it's interesting to consider it from that perspective of the Moirai.
Mm,
The Moirai, right, they are kind of separate from the gods. So the Moirai, the ones that are in charge of kind of your allotment and, cutting the thread of fate, killing you to some extent, like
mhm,
cutting that line. They were not under control of the gods. In some myths, they said Zeus could kind of like, have a little bit of sway, but the only one that could influence them was Ananke, which was their mother, which is necessity. And
right.
so in that sense, it's like this concept of fate is not always necessarily related to God's choice, I
Mm,
think. And I think sometimes we can think like, why are bad things happening to me? Like if God loves me, if the gods love me, whatever you kind of interface with or feel comfortable with, if the universe, spirit, whatever it might be, then why is this happening? And I think from my perspective, fate is a roll of the dice. It is completely neutral. It is not someone picking bad things for you. It is a constant roll. Sometimes we're going to roll double sixes. Sometimes we're going to roll something really shitty. And that's
mm,
going to suck and it's going to hurt like hell. And I've been through a lot in my life too. I've experienced real trauma as well. And it's not necessarily something that you ever want to go through or that you can ever justify or feel like there's a reason that those things happen to you or a lesson that can be learned from them. But I still think that it doesn't necessarily mean that God has turned against you. It just means the roll of the dice in that situation was shitty.
mm,
And sometimes that's just the way it goes. And that's where we think about those constant cycles, right? Kind of the upswing of the wheel and the downswing of the wheel. And I think it's more about kind of having a relationship with a higher power in the sense that there is meaning in the world, that we are all connected and that there's a purpose that we are all here to do and kind of live out. But that doesn't necessarily mean that someone's choosing bad things to happen to us. Does that
mhm.
make sense or kind of answer that question a little bit?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I just want to kind of extrapolate on that just a little bit and
Yeah.
just give context. Like I'm not like I'm not putting it on you to explain it, and because I don't think there is an answer beyond our own experience. And I say that because like I've said, this is kind of an age old question, and literally there is a branch of like philosophy and theology called theodicy, which is this centers around this question of if God is all powerful and if God is good, how does evil exist?
Yeah.
Those are kind of the premise. And there's, Thomas Aquinas and XYZ, all of these people have written tomes and tomes on the question of theodicy. And we don't really have an answer. So it's like, I'm not putting it on you. I think that, and I just want to be clear about that because want to just point to the difficulty of some of these hard questions in life. And I will just say for myself, I really resonate with your explanation. And it took me years, I will say, to go from this place of like, hearing people say everything happens for a reason and feeling quite resentful about that, feeling quite resentful about the idea that if God loves me, and like, how could I have experienced all of these things? Or if the things I've experienced in my life are fated, how could God be good? Like, God's a bastard if this is how it's. And what I really came to is the conclusion that you spoke to. It's like, shit happens. Life is chaotic. And I've found that by having spirituality in my life, by having a relationship with divinity, I've been able to find meaning and purpose. And I've been able to turn those experiences that I've had that were breaks. I'm reminded of the Japanese kind of like filling the cracks with gold kind of thing, where you take something that's been broken and you make it more beautiful as a result. And it's like, I am who I am because of the things that happened to me. And I think it's a slippery slope to be like, okay, well, those things are good or what have you. Like, I wouldn't wish certain things on anybody that I've experienced, but I am a lot of good things as a result of having to walk through that. And I think I've been able to walk through that with like divine help. And so, I just want to share that just because I think that this is really important. And I think it ties in with this idea of like fatedness and what is fated and what is free will and what does being a human mean if things are in some way determined.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're saying that, it makes me think about kind of what we were talking about with fortune houses earlier, and how sometimes you start going down certain paths and you can't turn back after a certain point, right? Certain things might happen to you, certain circumstances. All you can do is kind of keep moving forward and carving your path forward. Those events are still going to shape the path that you go down. And in some ways, they might lead you to a path that's really beautiful, but you never would have gotten there if you wouldn't have gone through that difficult experience. That's not to say that that experience has value or is good. It just means it set you on a course that maybe you wouldn't have gone down if that hadn't occurred. And I think that's where, in my mind, I really visualize it as someone walking through a forest and having a bunch of different paths laid in front of them, and those slowly kind of decreasing, in nature. And you can kind of think about certain things, certain experiences happening to you. And then one of those paths veers off to the right or veers off to the left, or kind of, goes away into the brush. And I think there's something really beautiful about that imagery that can kind of help us understand what's happening here. Is like, we're just kind of carving our path through the forest. And sometimes we're going to go completely off path and then find our way back. And that's all, these fortune or fated circumstances, and then how we respond to them, that helps us kind of find that path and what that looks like for us. And I think most people, when they get to the end of their life, they look back and say, all of the things that happened brought me to where I am now. And that's what fate is, right? Like, we're constantly building on all of the things that have happened to us so we can kind of keep moving forward. And I think that's kind of what fortune speaks to, right? Like, all of those little things that kind of push us a little bit deeper or, down our path in a different way.
Yeah, I will say, like, last thought on this is you just reminded me of This American Life episode that I randomly listened to a few years ago, where it was about time travel, and they interviewed people about whether they would go back and change something in their life. And like, there was a relationship between the people who said yes and age. And what they found was that the people who were older were just like, no, I wouldn't go back, because it's kind of like the effusive element of like fate or of personality, perhaps, where it's just like, I would have to change everything to change one thing.
And we are an accumulation of our experiences. And I think ZR almost illustrates that in a really cool way, is that you can see you're constantly building on what came before. Like we are
Mm,
constantly evolving. And, I think, yeah, like you said, maybe when you get to the end, you wouldn't change some of those things because it brought you down the exact path, because maybe you wouldn't have met the love of your life or had your children or found your career or your passion or all of these different things if that one event hadn't led you to the exact circumstances that needed to happen for you to meet that person, have that experience. So it's like we're saying, it's not like it's always going to feel good. I don't think fate is a comfortable thing. And
mm,
I say this as someone who reckons with fate all of the time and
yeah.
every single day of my life, and it's not always easy, but I do think that we're not necessarily, or like, I'm not necessarily here to choose the comfortable option. I'm here to seek truth. And I
Mm,
think the truth for me lies in what I can see and what I engage with every day, which is very much that fate is an active component in our lived reality and in our experiences. And so I would rather make friends with fate than fearing fate. And I think that's a constant process, but it's definitely what I'm trying to do. And
mm,
I think it can bring a lot of peace, can bring a
yeah.
lot of acceptance for just the ebb and flow. And like I said, I think it can be a really powerful tool for releasing some of the guilt or shame or blame that we tend to place on ourselves when we aren't doing as good as we perceive that we should be doing,
Hmm.
especially in the times that we live in where everybody is just like under a complete barrage of everyone else's success at every moment. And you're constantly
Mm,
feeling like you should be doing better, like you should be doing more, you should be more productive, producing more, do another thing, more free content, whatever it is.
yeah.
And I think ZR, Fate, all of this kind of shows you like, actually, no,
Mm,
everyone's on their own individual timeline. Everyone's going to have their peaks at different moments. You comparing yourself to the person who's standing next to you is completely irrelevant because they're on a different timeline than you. And you can see that very clearly with a list of dates in front of you. I can bring it up and show you if you want, and I
hmm.
think that there's kind of something really like just heartwarming about knowing that, and about knowing that you're not doing anything wrong. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
just ebb, and that's okay. And that's part of the process. And it should. We are not made to be productive and peaking all of the time. Like we would just burn out. You have to
Hmm.
have those moments of rest and respite and downtime to kind of be able to show up in your totality when the time is right. And so, sometimes we have to go through those more like fallow or slow moments, to prepare ourselves for the big moments that are to come in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think learning to let go enables us to really rest so that we can live out those seasons because, yeah, I think we don't live seasonally and we live astrology is a seasonal practice,
Mhm.
and I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that. And I think astrology can be really helpful because it can be like, okay, now is your time to rest.
Yep.
You're not going to make it happen right now.
Which
Let
can be hard to
go.
accept. It's
Yeah.
an easy thing, but it also requires you to have faith that the
Hmm.
wheel is going to turn back in your favor. When
Right.
you started this by saying, "Oh, you're a mercurial person," we were kind of talking about, Mercury retrogrades before we started the podcast. And, for me, every time I have a Mercury retrograde, like my business just drops off completely.
Mm,
Mercury also rules the second house in my business's birth chart. And so every time, there's like this 3-week period where it's just crickets.
mm,
And every time I go through this moment of kind of freaking out a little bit, like, is everything going wrong? And then, stepping into that space of no, this is just like the slow moment. This is to help you like rest. This is so you can catch up on all of the things you need to do so you can show up when things do pick up again. And knowing that, and I think astrology especially gives you the tools to know when those moments are, it helps you move through them with so much more grace and ease and understanding, instead of trying to just, push things super hard in one direction. Like you can kind of try to force the hand of fate, but fate's a little stronger than we are most of the time. So I think
mm.
you'll feel that resistance, and it's because you're not meant to be pushing and producing at that moment. And yeah, I think there's a really beautiful kind of just acceptance that can come from understanding that and knowing the cycles that we're living through at any given moment. Because like you said, it's a seasonal practice, and we are kind of seasonal beings, and we all have our own timelines. Even thinking about when someone's 12th house season is, right? Like all of those different things are going to affect how much we can show up, how much energy we have.
Mhm.
And instead of judging ourselves for not showing up in the ways that society wants us to be able to show up all of the time, just accepting that we're human beings having a human experience, I think is the better, maybe, or I don't want to say better, but maybe an easier kind of way to approach that.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I feel like closing thought for me is, again, thinking about the Serenity Prayer and thinking about how astrology can help us to cultivate the wisdom. It's one tool that can help us to cultivate the wisdom to know what we can change and what we can't change. It's not maybe the only tool we need. We need courage to know, like courage to change. And that's a whole other thing. And I think that this is where kind of like spirituality and astrology can really be hand in glove. But I'm just very reminded of like, yes, there are things we can't change. There are things that we can. And I need to cultivate wisdom through like spiritual help so that I can know the difference. Because on my own, I don't necessarily know, black from white, left from right.
I think it can be hard, right? You get lost in the mix. Like we kind of need a tool or a toolkit, and astrology gives you that blueprint. It's literally the map to figuring out your cycles and your timing and to all of those things. And so that can really give you that. Whereas before we're kind of all just, stumbling around in the dark, doing our best. And, sometimes we'll stumble into the right places and sometimes we're going to stumble into places that are not so welcoming, and I think that's where having that tool is really, really helpful and really supportive, and having that all kind of resting on a really strong spiritual foundation or religious foundation or whatever it is that you connect with is only going to deepen that understanding and help you access that wisdom from a bit more of a grounded place.
Absolutely. All right, Kira, any additional thoughts before we close?
I think we're good. I feel like we talked about a lot of different stuff. I feel pretty good about it. Do you
Awesome.
have any last things?
I feel great.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it was like, just so listeners know, like we're having, this is our first conversation we're ever having. So like, thank you for hanging in there with me for a really intense conversation. I really appreciate it. I thought it was wonderful. Pleasure to meet you and pleasure to talk to you. Where can we find you, Kira? Is there anything that you're working on that you'd like to tell us about?
You can find me on my website is probably the best place to find me given the current state of affairs with social media, but I'm on all of the things, Kira Astrology. I just put out a guidebook on the lots. I also have a lecture on the lots if you want to kind of explore those in a little bit more in depth. I have a lecture on stylical releasing. So if any of this stuff kind of, piqued your interest, go check that out and maybe you'll find some more goodies or insights within those things. And other than that, just open for readings, doing consultations and loving every bit of it,
Awesome. Yeah, I'll be sure to link all that in the show notes. And again, Kira, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to meet you and chat with you today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I feel the exact same way, and I'm really glad we had this opportunity to connect.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.